Okay, good evening, everyone. So first of all, the words of Torah that we are going to discuss should be a merit for the healing of all those who are wounded in the war. Specifically, most recently today, 10 soldiers were wounded, so have them in mind. And Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, the prophet, he once said, Tzion hi, Zion, Doresh Einla. It has no one seeking her. He was lamenting the fact that no one was seeking out Zion. And the Talmud says, if he is lamenting the fact that no one is seeking Zion, it must be that there is a obligation to seek out Lidrosh, Tzion, to seek out Zion. Makes sense? He's lamenting the fact that no one's doing it. That implies that you should be doing it. What does it mean, Lidrosh? What does the word Lidrosh mean? 3 meanings. Nachmanides tells us that it means to pray. And we indeed pray for Zion every day. Numerous times we're going to discuss that. Secondly, Lidrosh means to seek out, to find something, to visit, to explore. We do that as well. And the third meaning of Lidrosh is the word drasha, which means to expound upon, to study, to learn the Torah of. So when we learn and study about the land of Israel, that is a fulfillment of what Jeremiah said, that we should be seeking out Zion. So we are on part 2, which is Israel and the Jews. Last week, we spoke about Israel and Judaism and the intrinsic connection that it's inseparable. The Torah, Judaism, and the land of Israel are inseparable. We saw that in many different ways. What we're going to look at tonight is the fact that the Jewish people have actually preserved that relationship with the land of Israel, despite the fact that we've been in exile for so long. So I'm going to do a brief tour of 3,000 years of history in hopefully 10, 15 minutes. But mostly the history of the Jewish people related to the land of Israel. Let's begin with Abraham, who was born in the Jewish year 1948, by sheer coincidence. He was born the Jewish year 1948. The first word of God to Abraham, who is the first Jew, is go to Israel. And we know that Abraham went to Israel. There we have, of course, the oldest recorded purchase of land, which is the negotiations Abraham had with the Hittites. We discussed this last week. I didn't mention this, but he paid 400 shekel for a cave. Now, you could say, well, okay, 400 shekel, what's that? Yeah. So the Code of Hammurabi, which is around that time, was a legal code, and it details in the Code of Hammurabi that the average worker earned between 7 and 8 shekel per year. So if you're earning 7 to 8 shekel per year and you're paying 400 shekel for a cave, that's like Manhattan prices. That's very expensive, right? But we have Abraham then also living in Beersheba. So our ancestors lived in Israel until, of course, so did Isaac, who never left Israel. Jacob, Yaakov, who was forced to leave because of famine, went down to Egypt. And of course, we have the entire story of the exile of the Jewish people in Egypt. But we do know that in Egypt, it was very, very interesting to note that that Jacob, before he died, what did he say to his son Yosef? He said, make sure that you bury me in Israel. I do not want to be buried in Egypt. That, by the way, is something which is still done. It's mentioned in the Code of Jewish Law, the custom. People want to be buried in Israel. But it goes all the way back to Jacob, who asked to be buried in Israel. Joseph told his brothers to bury him in Israel. And indeed, when the Jews came out of Egypt, they took with them the sarcophagi with the bones of Yosef and the other tribes, the 12 tribes, back to Israel to be buried there. Yosef, of course, buried in Shechem, and the other patriarchs are buried in Hebron. So in Egypt, by the way, you might know that the Jews built the tabernacle in the desert, which lasted actually for approximately 440 years, and much of it was built of a wood called Atzei Shittim, which is acacia wood. That is native to North Africa, and it's found in Israel. And where do they get the acacia wood from? So the Midrash tells us that when the brothers when Jacob went down to Egypt, they took with them saplings of acacia wood from the land of Israel, Atzei Shittim, and they planted them in Egypt. And it was known amongst some of the Jews as the forest of faith. Forest of faith. The forest that reminded them that one day we're going to go back to the land where those trees came from. And when they left Egypt, they took the wood from those trees with them, and from that they made the Mishkan, which is pretty amazing. I can't prove that, but it's a very interesting midrash. The Jewish people come out of Egypt, and as we know, 40 years later, they enter into the land of Israel. And we have a fascinating record of that. There's a mysterious Middle-Late Bronze Age interchange, but we'll call them MBI people. It makes it a lot easier, right? But archaeologists refer to a people who first appear in Kadesh Barnea, that's northern Sinai. There are dwellings from that period in northern Sinai. Interesting, that's the place in Sinai where the Jews lived for 19 years. We were not wandering around all the time. It was not like overnight bivouacs, etc. We spent 19 years in Kadesh Barnea. That's the one place in Sinai where there's dwellings from that time. And the Jews entered Israel, as you know, from the east bank of the Jordan, across north of the Dead Sea, entering and first attacking Jericho, Jericho, afterwards Ai, etc. And that appears to be these mysterious MBI people, appears to be the Jewish people. We also have, discovered by Adam Zertal of Haifa University, an altar, a mizbeach, that is found on Mount Eval. There are two mountains that stand opposite each other, Mount Gerizim, Mount Eval. On Mount Eval, there is an altar that dates back approximately 3,300 years, and that altar has a number of interesting components. The stones of the altar are uncut. Now, some of you might be familiar with the fact that the Torah says that the stones of the altar, the mizbeach, are not supposed to be cut stones, specifically uncut. This altar, uncut stones. Secondly, there is a ramp leading up to it, not stairs, but a ramp. You might know the Torah tells us that there's supposed to be a ramp, not stairs. And third, they found the bones of only kosher mammals around this altar, as opposed to other altars of that time which had non-kosher animals. And fourth, they also found Egyptian scarab decorations somewhere in the vicinity of the altar. So Adam Zertal of Haifa University is convinced that this is the altar that Joshua built when they first came into Israel, and they made a covenant on Mount Gerizim and Mount Eval. That's pretty amazing to find that altar, and that is presumed to be the altar of Joshua that was built. By the way, drone surveys of the altar and of other sites in that area that date back to that time seem to indicate that they had the shape of a footprint. And one of the ideas behind that, anyone studied the book of Joshua, you might know that very famously, what does God tell Yehoshua? Kol makom. Correct. Kol makom asher tidroch kaf raglechem. Every place where your foot steps will be yours. So maybe when the Jews built these sites when they came into Israel, they built them in the form, they didn't have drones then, but they built them in a form of a footstep, as though to indicate the Jewish people's footsteps are coming into the Canaan, to the land of Israel, which is quite amazing. Of course, we have one of the earliest non-biblical records of the Jews' existence in Israel is the famous Merneptah stela. Pharaoh Merneptah boasts of conquering the nation Israel in the land of Canaan. That's the reference right there. I've enlarged it for those who read hieroglyphics. It starts this way, goes that way. But it actually refers to the Israelites. The nation uses the word nation. The name given is Israel, and they're living in the land of Canaan. This is approximately 3,000 years ago. The Jewish people are in Israel. And very soon after this, we entered Israel in about 1217 BCE, and about 400 years later, we established the first monarchy, which was King Saul. King Saul's monarchy ended in tragedy, as we know. The expression throwing yourself on the sword came from King Saul's death on Mount Gilboa. And, when you start to read the prophets, the writings, etc., you feel we're talking about people who lived in Israel, knew the geography. King Saul's body is taken to the city of Beit Sha'an, which is, of course, just south of the Kinneret in the Beit Sha'an Valley. There are 5 kibbutzim there now. If you like, Kolkat Tirat Tzvi is there. Anyway, so the King David then takes over. We actually have a record of King David from King Mutba'al of Transjordan, who writes to Pharaoh Akhenaten and he mentions 5 major personalities in the book of Samuel, one of them being King David, one of them being King David's father, another one being the chief of staff. And of course, the Jewish people continue there. David, by the way, was not a minor renegade or gang leader. We find him described as that king of the house of David, a royal dynasty. And other remnants from that, of course, are what we call these things, which are bullae. A bullae is a little clay seal. You know, they used to write letters. They'd write them on parchment and roll them up. Then you'd tie it with string. Then to make sure the seal was not broken, you would take some clay, put it on the knot, and then you'd stamp it with your signet ring, not a stamp ring. And that would be called a bullae. We have bullae, a collection of them from the city of David, of the old kings of Israel. And one of the bullae is signed by someone called, someone who is the scribe of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah the prophet, and we have, I think I have it here, Gemariyahu ben Shaphan. We have 3 bullae of Gemariyahu ben Shaphan, all found near Jerusalem in what's called the city of David. So the Jewish people progress. We have a kingdom that lasts for 300 years until the Assyrians come in. This is the oldest picture you'll see of a Jew, as far as I know, the oldest depiction of Jews. Here are Jews being led out of Lachish by an Assyrian soldier. What do the Jews have in their hands? Harps. They have harps. What does that remind you of? The famous Al-Naharot, but correct. In Psalms, in Tehillim, we have a very famous section that says, by the rivers of Babylon, where we wept, we remembered Zion. And it says there, our captors asked us, sing songs of Zion. And what did we say? Eich Nashir. Shira, how can we sing songs of Hashem in a foreign land? We hang up our harps on the trees. And here you see, this is from the British Museum, but it was originally found in Neve, which is modern-day Iraq. And here we have Jews being led out of Israel with harps in hand. Of course, the Jewish kingdom continued, broke into 2, as we know. We had Israel in the north, Yehuda in the south, the king of Judea. By the way, that's where we get our name from. But one of the kings of Judea famously was Chizkiah, Hezekiah the king. And if you go to Jerusalem today, some of you may have been to Chizkiah's tunnel. Chizkiah is besieged by the Assyrians. He has a tunnel dug under the walls of the old city, this tunnel, in order to bring water from a fortified spring into the city of Jerusalem. There's an older tunnel under that, which is a Canaanite tunnel. That tunnel is also mentioned in the Tanakh, in the Bible. Where is that mentioned? King David infiltrated his troops into Jerusalem when the Hittites were there through that tunnel. So it was an ancient, so there's 2 tunnels under Jerusalem from antiquity, one of them from the time of Chizkiah. By the way, there is a plaque, which is now in Istanbul, stolen by the Ottomans. It's in a museum in Istanbul. There's a plaque that was in the middle of this tunnel that signifies where the diggers met from that side and from the other side. They met in the middle, and they inscribed a plaque of where they met in the middle of having dug that tunnel, which is pretty amazing. About 100 years after, around this time, we also had the Sancherev, who captures actually doesn't capture him, but he has a siege on Jerusalem, and this is described in a very famous clay prism, which pretty much reflects the biblical account in which Chizkiah is under siege in Jerusalem. And about 100 years after the Assyrians, Babylon comes in, destroys the temple, the first temple, and exiles the Jews to Babylon, Iraq, Iran. And of course, these are two stela from Babylon, and in one of them, it's actually written in cuneiform. It boasts of the Babylonians destroying the Jewish temple in the month of Av. Av, as you might know, is when we mourn for the temple, Tisha B'Av, but it's actually a Babylonian name of the month, and here is one of the records of that. The Jews And some of the witnesses of the destruction, one of them was Jeremiah the prophet. And as I mentioned before, he had two friends. One was Baruch ben Neriah, who wrote down Jeremiah's prophecies, and the other one was Gemariah ben Shaphan, who read them out. And we have bulle from both of them. We have bulle, one says Baruch ben Neriah HaSofer, it's written in Old Hebrew script, Baruch the son of Neriah, the scribe, and the other one is Gemariah ben Shaphan. So usually bulle did not survive because if they're clay, they're going to get smashed. But if they are baked in the fires of destruction, which these were, then they are going to be solid and they will remain, and that's what these were. But as we know, after the 70 years in Babylon, the Purim story happened, then the Jews returned to Israel and under Ezra and Nehemiah build the second temple, which, as you know, that part there, that blue part, that's where the Western Wall is, which, as you see, is a retaining wall of the Temple Mount. It's not actually a wall of the temple, it's a retaining wall of the Temple Mount. And if you can't see that, am I in the way? How's that? Sorry. I have to refocus. Right. So that's the Western Wall. And, of course, also what remains is over here, we have Sha'ar Huldah, the gate of Huldah the prophetess, and the stairs of the elders where she used to stand there and teach people. So the first temple altogether lasted for 420 years. So the Jews had been, if you're following now, we were in Israel for 440 years from the time we entered under Joshua. The temple lasted for 420 years. So we're now talking about approximately 860 years of a Jewish independent commonwealth in the land of Israel, with Jerusalem as the capital, except for the first 8 years, Hebron was the capital. But 860 years Jewish independence in Israel. The second temple is built 70 years later. We have some remnants of the second temple. By the way, anyone been to Jerusalem, you may have heard 40 minutes before sundown on Friday, what do you hear? Huh? That's right, a siren. The origin of that siren is this gentleman here. A Kohen, a priest, would stand on the walls of the temple, blow a trumpet to announce the coming of Shabbat. A stone was actually found from a niche in the temple walls, and you can probably read it. It's actually in regular Hebrew script. Can you read that? I've got it actually down there as well. Lebeit hatikiyah lahachriz, the place of blowing to proclaim. So when we have a siren blowing 40 minutes before Shabbat to remind you to light candles in Jerusalem, its origin is the Second Temple era. It's actually mentioned in the Mishnah. So we're there during the time of the Second Temple. We have autonomy until 200 years, around 200 years into the Second Temple era. We have Alexander's kingdom has split up. It's now in three parts. The Greek Macedon area in Greece, Macedon, the Seleucids in Syria, and the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. And of course, in between Syria and Egypt, right, the filling of the souvlaki is Israel. Right? We are right smack between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Seleucids under Antiochus invade. We have the famous Maccabean revolt. And by the way, that is a menorah. You can see it's a Hanukkah menorah. Notice it's got how many holes for the oil, for the wicks? 8 plus one off to the side, which is the shamash, 9. And the hole in the middle there is to put the oil in. That's where you pour the oil in. That dates back, according to the Israel Antiquities Authority, that dates back to 70 years after the events of Hanukkah. So if you can imagine, whoever lit that menorah may have witnessed the events of Hanukkah, or their parents did, or maybe grandparents. That's quite amazing when you think about that. And this is an oil jug, probably the type of jug that was found by the Maccabees with the seal of the high priest. This is actually a jug. It holds about 2 litres of oil, which is about how much you needed to light the menorah for one night. And there's traces of olive oil in that. And that's probably the type of jug that was found. So after the Hasmoneans successfully defeat the Seleucid Greeks, the Hellenists, they re-establish an independent Jewish country that lasted for about 200 years. Unfortunately, it started to descend into corruption. The Romans came in. The Romans destroy the Second Temple, and famously that's detailed from the Arch of Titus. They march into Rome with the menorah, a menorah. We're not sure about the menorah, but a menorah. We see also here the trumpets, and that's the table. These things look like television cameras, are actually plaques which the Romans carried depicting what they were bringing into Rome. Josephus Flavius points out that there was a museum in Rome called the Temple of Peace that was built by Titus, in which they'd place all the loot that they'd found, that they'd looted during war. That this is like Orwellian, but we live in Orwellian times. But the Temple of Peace, where they kept the loot, and that's actually where the menorah was kept, and sits the forehead plate of the high priest, all there in Rome. Of course, Rome was very proud of having defeated Israel, and they minted a coin. I have one of these at home, which is the famous Judea Capta coin. Judea Capta, there is the prisoners sitting under a tree. There is the triumphant Hadrian, and there is another picture, and Judea, that says here, Judea, right? I-U-D-A-E-A. Judea became J-I-H, like in Spanish, becomes a J, hence Judea and the Jews. But that's the famous coin. Yehuda is defeated, and the Arch of Titus. Now, of course, it didn't end there. Yes, Jewish independence, that was now 410 years of the Second Commonwealth. 200 years till the Maccabees, 200 years after, and then the Romans destroy everything. But even after that, the Jews did not lay down and turn over. What the Jews did was, we revolted again. In fact, Presenius Niger, a Roman general, called the Jews the most revolting of people. Right? We revolted against the Romans at least 3 times. But even after the destruction of the temple, we had the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we have many coins. The Bar Kokhba revolt, by the way, you can probably see on the coin that it's minted over another coin. You see I don't know if you can see that. You can see another coin. They stamped it over Roman coins. The reason for that is very simple. Social media. In the ancient times, coins were social media. How do you get messages out? You mint a coin. What happens with coins? They travel. Everyone uses coins for commerce. So if you want to get a message out that Judea has been defeated, the Romans mint a coin. You want to get a message out that Shimon is the Prince of Israel, and this is the first and second year of the redemption of Israel, he mints coins over the Roman coins and distributes them. That lasted, unfortunately, only two years, but 2.5 years. But nevertheless, and we also had the Jewish stand at Masada, the last stand of the Jews at Masada, and so on. But that wasn't the end of it, because we know that not long after the Bar Kokhba revolt, 20 years, we already had a revival of the Jewish community in the north of Israel, in the Galil and the Golan. And in the north, we mentioned this last time, the Mishnah was written by Judah the Prince in the north of Israel. And there was a flourishing community of scholars in the north of Israel. Unfortunately, what happened was that the Roman Empire became what's called the Holy Roman Empire. It became Christian. And then the oppression of the Jews got even worse. But even under that oppression, the Jewish people did produce works of scholarship. The Jerusalem Talmud, produced in Israel under that oppressive regime. And the Jews continued to be in Israel. The Byzantines, commentary on the Mishnah completed under the Byzantines in around 390. There was then followed by Arab rule, the Mamluks, the Persian invasion, the Mamluks, and of course it was under Arab rule in the 7th century where the Dome of the Rock was built on the site of the Temple Mount where our temple was. Just by the way, it's interesting, in Arabic, what do they call Jerusalem? Haram al-Sharif is the mosque, but what's Jerusalem? They call it Al-Quds. Al-Quds. Why Al-Quds? Because Al-Quds is a shorten of Bayt al-Muqdas, which means the temple. Because according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad went to the Temple Mount to meet Moses and to discuss with him how many times a day to pray. Hence, they have 5 times a day. I think Moses didn't like them, but whatever, right? So, but they, according to their tradition, they went to. But why did he go there? Because that's where the Jewish temple was. Hence, Al-Quds is actually a reference to our temple. The reason it was holy because our temple was there. Anyway, but the Jews did not give up at that point, even under Arab rule. Yes. Yeah.
So if that's,
No hard questions, but
if that's
yeah.
true, how come our representatives never bring that up?
They didn't come to my class. In addition, then following that, we had the Crusader kingdom that dominated Israel. The Crusaders, very cruel to the Jews in Israel, and made it very difficult for Jews to live there. But nevertheless, Jews still lived there. We know, last time I discussed the fact that the famous Aleppo Codex, the oldest written text of the entire Torah, prophets and writings, was actually stolen by Crusaders. Crusaders, as you know, built many castles in Israel, fortresses in Israel, but they were eventually defeated by the Saracens, by the Mamluks, by Salah al-Din. There's a street in Jerusalem, Rehov Salah al-Din, right? You can take the Rakevet Kala on that, the light rail. I remember my granddaughter, first time my daughter took her on, she said, we're going on the Rakevet Kala. She was so excited. She was envisioning a train filled with colours, brides, right? She's a little girl, she's a 6-year-old girl. She said, where are the colours? No, it's Rakevet Kala means the light rail. Kuf Lamed Hey, not Kala, bride. But okay, she was very disappointed. So the Salah al-Din defeats the Crusaders, and he allowed Jews back in Jerusalem, because one of the first things the Crusaders did was they took all the Jews they could find in Jerusalem, locked them in a synagogue and burnt it down with the Jews inside it. As Godfrey de Bouillon talks about, sobbing with joy at the cries of the Jews. The Saladin, whose physician, by the way, was the Rambam, Maimonides, allowed the Jews back into Jerusalem, and there started a resurgence of the Jewish people in Israel. Eventually, in the 16th century, it came under Ottoman rule, the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey, and after the expulsion from Spain, 1492, Portugal, 1497, there was an influx of Jews to Israel. A lot of them went to Tzfat in the north of Israel, very famous Kabbalists and others. And the land of Israel became a centre again of Jewish scholarship. There was good and bad. There was Nathan of Gaza. There was a Jewish community in Gaza back in the 15th and 16th century. Nathan of Gaza was infamous because he was a scholar who was the supporter of Shabtai Tzvi. He was his prophet, I put that in quotes, but he lived in Gaza, and there were synagogues there, and there were scholars in Hebron, there were scholars in Tiberias, there were scholars in Tzfat, etc. And the Jewish people had a steady influx of Jews to Israel, and of course there was. I just point out that, Nachmanides, when he came to Israel, actually found some ancient coins, ancient inscriptions. He writes about them in his commentary. This, by the way, I think we showed you last class, but this is a seal which says it's in Aramaic, but Aramaic is written in Hebrew letters. It says Dacha L'Yah, which means pure unto God. Very possibly the type of seal that would have sealed the oil of the Kohen Gadol. Now, we were, throughout history, the Jewish people were in Israel, and we were out, but more Jewish people lived outside Israel than in Israel. So how do we maintain our attachment to the land of Israel? Well, one way we did that was we maintained Hebrew, not as a language of regular daily speech, but as a language of prayer and the language of scholarship. There's a story, Abraham, the son of Maimonides. That would have been rough. Right, so, that's what he's called, Avraham, son of the Rambam, right? But he was a great scholar in his own right. So he writes about how he met a rabbi from Paris who was on his way to Israel via Cairo, and the rabbi from Paris and Avraham, the son of Maimonides, discussed Torah together. What language did they speak? The rabbi from Paris would have spoken French. Avraham, son of Maimonides, spoke Arabic. The language they had in common was Hebrew. And the same is true if you would have gone to the yeshiva of the Rashba in Barcelona, you would have had to know some Hebrew. If you would have gone to the yeshiva in Worms in northern Germany, where Rashi studied when he was a teenager, you would have had to know some Hebrew to study Jewish texts, to communicate and to pray Hebrew. So this Hebrew is one of the ways the Jews have preserved our connection to the land of Israel. Not only that, but if you look at there is an entire range of laws revolving around the idea of remembering the land of Israel. Here is a very enthusiastic groom who's actually, maybe he's an MMA practitioner. But we're supposed to, at every Jewish wedding, Code of Jewish law says you're supposed to break a glass under the chuppah. Why do we do that? Many theories, all wrong. Last chance he gets to put his foot down. Last time he breaks something without being yelled at. No, all wrong, right? Rather, it is in order to fulfill the oath that we took, Im eshkachech, Yerushalayim, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its cunning. If I don't raise you over my greatest joy, then let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. So we are fulfilling, by breaking a glass, we are fulfilling that actual idea of remembering Jerusalem. And not only that, but every time I was giving a lecture somewhere and there was a group of Christians who had come and they said, we also have an attachment to the land of Israel. So I asked them, I said, how often in your prayers do you mention Israel and Jerusalem every day? They had no answer. They mention it not very often. I say, you know what? Every time a Jew, traditional Jew, eats dates, figs, pomegranates, grapes, olives, wheat, barley, rye, spelt, or oats. Every time we have bread, every time we have cake, every time we have one of those fruits, the precious fruits of the land of Israel, we say a special blessing. We say a special blessing, and in that blessing, whether it's the blessing after the fruits, we mention Jerusalem, we mention Zion, we mention the land of Israel. If after having bread, grace after meals, Birkat HaMazon, the second blessing is all about a praise for God for the land of Israel. We maintained even the fruit, even if the fruit was not from Israel, but it was a fruit that was one of the fruits that Israel is blessed with, we would say a special blessing. My father, Alav Shalom, grew up in Poland. He was the only survivor of his family after the Second World War, but he told me when he was a kid, he remembers that in the 1920s, 1930s, they lived in Poland. They were upper middle class, modern Orthodox family in Poland. And he says on Tu B'Shvat, New Year of Trees, they used to get a crate of oranges, Jaffa oranges from Israel, brought to Poland. Right. Remembers always having that. Unbelievable. And, but the Jewish people never forgot that. Wine, because its origin is Israel. This, by the way, are some of the earliest wine labels from the wineries in Israel. Carmel, which established by the Rothschilds in Zichron Yaakov. When they made the first batch of wine, they sent it to Jewish dignitaries around the world. One of them, they sent to the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. His son was Mayor Berlin, changed his name to Bar Ilan. There's a university named after him. The Netziv was the head of a famous yeshiva in Volozhin. When he was told that there was a bottle of wine from Israel, produced by Jews in Israel, first time in 2,000 years, he said, wait. He went to his study, put on his Shabbat clothing, his shtreimel and his silk coat to greet the bottle of wine from Israel. When the bottle of wine was placed in his hands, he started crying. When he read the label and he saw Eretz Yisrael and he saw it's written in Hebrew, he couldn't contain himself. I mean, I don't know. I always buy only Israeli wine. But, I don't cry every time after a few bottles maybe. But, in general, right, that's how attached we were. The Jewish people had that incredible attachment to Israel. And, you've probably seen this in many Jewish homes, right? Some people leave a square of the house unplastered to, talking about being plastered. But, yes, and not only that, but the poetry and the songs of the Jewish people. I won't go through all the Shabbat Zmirot, but in the Zmirot of Shabbat, the songs we sing at the Shabbat table, the songs we sing Friday night, the songs we sing in the synagogue, a lot of it is poetry about the land of Israel. One of the most famous poets was Yehuda Halevi, 12th century Spain, who actually moved to Israel, was killed at the gates of Jerusalem. And one of his most famous poems, he wrote 800 poems about the land of Israel. One of them starts with, Libi b'mizrach va'ani b'sof ma'arav. My heart is in the east, and I am in the ends of the west. How can I find savor? And he talks about this, and another famous one, which we say on Tisha B'Av, Tzion, halot tishali l'shlom asiraya, Zion, will you not ask about those who are the peace of your prisoners? So the Jewish people maintained this incredible connection to Israel, whether it was through the fruit of the land, whether it was wine from Israel, the blessings we say on that fruit, Birkat HaMazon, which is every single time we have bread, we say an entire blessing about the land of Israel. Not only that, but there has been an ancient custom, as I said, dating back to Jacob, that to be buried in the land of Israel, and in the Code of Jewish Law, in the glosses of Rabbi Moshe Isserles, he points out that it's customary that many people put soil from the land of Israel in their, if they're not buried in Israel, they at least put some soil from Israel in their coffin if they're buried outside of Israel. And we have entire times of the year, 3 weeks of the year, where we mourn for the land of Israel and for the city of Jerusalem. The Kotel used to be called the Wailing Wall. Right? That's because Jews would go there and wail and cry. But what are we crying about? About the incompleteness of the city of Jerusalem, the lack of the temple, the fact that the Jews are scattered and separate throughout the world, as we mentioned. And it was something which was very, very central throughout history. Was this morning, Tisha B'Av. You can still see people on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, sitting on the floor, and people literally crying about the land of Israel and crying about our exile. Unfortunately, there's a lot to cry about. There's a lot to celebrate as well. We just celebrated Yom HaAtzmaut, but we understand that there's a process here, and what the state of Israel that we just celebrated this last week, the establishment of the state of Israel, was not something that came yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing, ex nihilo. There were Jewish states in Israel that lasted over, as I pointed out, over 1,200 years. One was lasted for 860 years, the other one for 410 years. That's incredible. So the Jewish people, when we came back to Israel, we came back to Israel. We were thrown out. Yehuda Avner, anyone heard of Yehuda Avner? You should read the book, The Prime Ministers. Yehuda Avner was an advisor and speechwriter for five Israeli prime ministers, amongst them Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, Menachem Begin. Incredible. So he has an insider's view of what was going on. Fantastic book called The Prime Ministers. In one of the stories, he became eventually Israeli ambassador to England, to the United Kingdom, when he was introduced to the Queen Elizabeth. Now, I should point out, Yehuda Avner was born in Manchester, made Aliyah to Israel when he was a teenager, and he still had a Mancusian accent. So he is introduced to the Queen as the Israeli ambassador. She says, this is quite unusual, Ambassador Avner. I don't remember an ambassador who was not born in the country that he represents. You are obviously from Manchester. He says, yes, my body was born in Manchester. He says, but my soul was born in Jerusalem. And 2,000 years ago, the Romans exiled me from Jerusalem. And she said, did they really? And how do you like the weather here in England? Great, anyway, God save the Queen. Anyway, so, but he is right. Right? His soul was born in Jerusalem, and the Romans exiled it. And the Jewish soul is attached to Israel. Right? And Jews throughout the world have made their way to Israel, whether it was Jews from Salonika, who now were stevedores in Salonika and now afterwards worked in the port of Haifa, whether it was Jews from Poland and Jews from Russia, Lithuania, etc., etc. Jews from all over the world have come to Israel. In our apartment building, I used to live in Har Nof. We used to have a Va'ad Bayit. That's one of the worst components of Israel. But anyway, Va'ad Bayit is where you have the committee of the apartment building. In our apartment building, there was a family from South Africa. There was a family from France. There was a family from Gibraltar. There was a family from England. There was a family Australia. There was a family from Canada. And there were two families who were Israelis. Right? In one building, we had the entire kibbutz galuyot, in gathering of the exile. I remember when I did army service, I did shlav beit. So I entered in as a rabbi. I was with a group of people who all entered in when they made Aliyah in their 30s. So we had a bunch of engineers, a bunch of rabbis, a bunch of lawyers, and a bunch of doctors. Right? And all in our 30s, and there was one 18-year-old Israeli who was in charge of training us. I think he was on punishment duty, without doubt. The amount of languages was crazy. I'm standing next to an Ethiopian Jew on one side and a guy from Germany, a Jew from Germany on the other side. The Jew from Germany did not speak Hebrew. The Ethiopian did not speak Hebrew. I was using my little Yiddish to try to translate military commands for the German guy. Yiddish is not one of the great military languages, Nehmen de M16 and give a Klapp dorten, and it's not exactly, shoot the Cossack, whatever. It's not, but my Yiddish is not very good, and the Ethiopian, to my shock, did not understand Yiddish, right? And I'm trying to explain to them, and we had 2 translators for every command. One translated into Russian, one translated into English, and I translated into Yiddish. It was like crazy, right? But this is Israel. And the fact that there are Jews like that from all over the world in the land of Israel is a testimony to the Jewish people's attachment to Israel. There's no way that modern political Zionism could have possibly achieved what it achieved without the fact that the Jewish people for thousands of years were preserving the passion, the romance, and the relationship with Israel. The Jewish people maintained that presence in Israel from antiquity to modern times. We've had independent Jewish states existed in Israel for over 1,000 years, well before the state of Israel. Jews strive to live in Israel. There's been Aliyah throughout history. We commemorate the temple, Jerusalem, and the land of Israel in many customs. Our name and language, the fact that we call Jews from Judea, Judeus, Yehuda, Yehudim, is a testimony to our origins. The language is linked to the land of Israel. That's the language of archaeology in Israel. The Jewish people have nurtured and preserved a love for Israel through 2,000 years of exile that culminated in the state of Israel. And the prophecy of Zechariah, who said that old men and old women will again dwell in the streets of Jerusalem, and the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the streets. That's a miracle. The fact that we see that is incredible, but it's a testimony not only to God's divine intervention, but it's also a testimony to the Jewish people's incredible devotion to the land of Israel. Next week, God willing, we're going to talk about the legal components of our claim to Israel in terms of international law, in terms of history, archaeology, politics. We'll talk about the gifts of the state of Israel. We'll talk about the relationships of Israel to the rest of the world. And we will, hopefully, that will be the conclusion of this, unless there's a 4th in the trilogy, I don't know. But at least that will be the 3rd in this series. And thank you very much for coming. And God willing, see you next week.